In the summer of 1945, a classified Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency memo instructed American officers to physically remove the Nazi Party membership records of at least 80 German scientists before those files reached the State Department, because without that deletion, every one of them would have been barred from entering the United States under the direct orders of President Truman. The story of how those men entered America anyway begins not in Washington, but in a tunnel. Specifically, it begins in the Harz Mountains of central Germany, in a system of underground chambers carved into the limestone by forced labor, where the most advanced rocket program in human history had been operating in secret since 1943. The facility was called Mittelwerk. It ran nearly 2 miles beneath the surface, and in the final weeks of the war, as Allied forces closed in from both sides of a collapsing Reich, the men who had built the weapons manufactured in those tunnels made a calculation that would shape the next quarter century of American history. They chose who to surrender to, and they chose very carefully. Wernher von Braun was 33 years old in the spring of 1945. He had been the technical director of the V-2 ballistic missile program since its inception, the man most responsible for solving the engineering problems that had turned Adolf Hitler's demand for a weapon that could strike London from the continent into a physical reality. He held the rank of Sturmbannführer in the SS. He had joined the Nazi Party in 1937. He had attended meetings at Mittelwerk and seen with his own eyes the conditions under which the missiles were being built. In April 1945, with Soviet forces advancing from the east and American forces pushing through from the west, von Braun convened a meeting of his senior staff at Peenemünde, the Baltic Coast research facility where the V-2 had been developed. The question on the table was not whether to surrender. The collapse of the Reich was beyond question by that point. The question was to whom. The Soviet Union was closer geographically, but von Braun and his colleagues had watched what Soviet forces did in the territories they captured, and they had a more specific concern. The Soviets, in their assessment, would extract what they needed from German scientists through compulsion rather than cooperation. They would be useful but not free. The Americans, von Braun believed, would offer something different. They would offer resources, laboratories, continuation of the work, and the prospect of an actual career in the country that was going to dominate the post-war world. Von Braun gave instructions to his team to scatter the V-2 technical documents, 14 tons of blueprints, test data, and engineering specifications, across the mountains and farmland of Bavaria, hiding them from both the SS officers who had orders to destroy them and the advancing Allied forces who would have seized them. The documents were hidden in an abandoned mine shaft near the town of Dornton. Von Braun then led a convoy of his key personnel westward, through the chaos of the final days of the Reich, specifically to reach American lines. On May 2, 1945, his younger brother Magnus von Braun rode a bicycle toward an American checkpoint near Reuth in the Austrian Alps. He found a private from the 44th Infantry Division named Fred Schneikert and told him, in broken English, that his brother and a group of rocket scientists wanted to surrender. Schneikert, by his own later account, had no idea what to do with this information. Within days, the significance had traveled up the chain of command. American intelligence officers who had been specifically tasked with locating German scientific personnel, part of a program called Operation Overcast, which would later be renamed Operation Paperclip, recognized immediately what they had. Von Braun and his team were not simply prisoners of war. They were the most valuable scientific asset that the defeat of Nazi Germany had made available, and the competition to secure that asset was already underway. The British had their own exploitation program, the French were actively recruiting German engineers, and the Soviets, who had captured Peenemünde itself, along with the production facilities and a substantial number of lower-level technical personnel, were moving quickly. The race to acquire the human capital of the German rocket program was as real and as urgent as any military operation of the final weeks of the war. American intelligence moved von Braun and his core team into protective custody at Garmisch-Partenkirchen in Bavaria. They were treated not as prisoners but as guests. They were fed well, housed comfortably, and interviewed extensively by officers who were simultaneously building the case for bringing them to the United States permanently. The 14 tons of documents hidden in the mine shaft were recovered by Army ordnance officers who drove out to Bavaria with a specific directive: secure the technical records before they could be seized by any other Allied power or destroyed. The documents were loaded onto trucks and transported to a secure facility. They represented the complete technical history of the V-2 program. Every calculation, every test result, every engineering solution that had taken a decade and the labor of thousands of people to produce. What American intelligence had acquired within weeks of Germany's surrender was the complete V-2 program, the documents, the hardware, and the men who had built it. What was not yet resolved was the question of what to do with those men once their value had been fully understood. Because the answer to that question required decisions that could not be made by intelligence officers in Bavaria. It required decisions made in Washington, and the people in Washington who had the authority to make those decisions had just finished fighting a war against the regime that these men had served. The official policy that emerged from that political reality was clear enough on paper. It was what happened to that policy over the following months, in the gap between what Washington declared and what Army intelligence actually did, that became the hidden history of Operation Paperclip. The press release that the War Department issued in the autumn of 1945 was a careful piece of work. It described the arrival of a group of German scientific specialists who would be assisting the United States Army with technical research and development. It emphasized their expertise. It noted that their knowledge would be invaluable in the ongoing effort to maintain American military superiority in the post-war world. It said nothing about their political histories. It said nothing about the organization that had employed them before the Americans arrived. It said nothing about the facilities where their work had been carried out, or the people who had carried out the labor that made that work possible. The American public received the story that had been prepared for them. German rocket scientists, brilliant men displaced by the chaos of war, were coming to help America reach for the stars. It was a narrative with the clean lines of a recruitment poster. Technical genius in the service of democratic progress, the spoils of victory transformed into the foundations of a better future. It was also in its essential architecture a fabrication. Not in every detail. The scientists were genuinely talented. Their technical knowledge was genuinely valuable. The rockets they would eventually help build would genuinely work. These facts were real, and the official narrative was careful to stay close to them, because the closer a cover story stays to verifiable truth, the more durable it becomes. What the cover story omitted was the complete context in which that talent had been developed and deployed. It omitted the institutional affiliations. It omitted the wartime records. It omitted the specific question, a question that American intelligence had already investigated and answered internally, of what these men had known and done and sanctioned in the years before they rode bicycles toward American checkpoints in the Austrian Alps. Wernher von Braun gave his first American press interview in 1947. He was charming, articulate, and visionary in a way that translated naturally into the optimistic idiom of post-war American journalism. He talked about rockets reaching the moon. He talked about space stations. He talked about humanity's destiny among the stars. He spoke English with a slight accent that seemed, in the cultural moment of 1947, to carry the romantic weight of European sophistication rather than the darker associations it might otherwise have suggested. American newspapers loved him. Time magazine would eventually put him on its cover. Walt Disney would hire him as a technical consultant for a series of television programs about space exploration that reached tens of millions of American households in the mid-1950s. Disney's programs presented von Braun as the authoritative voice of American space ambition, a scientist visionary explaining, in accessible terms, how humanity would leave the Earth. The programs were enormously influential in building public support for what would become the space program. Von Braun understood the American media with an instinct that seemed almost native. He grasped that in the United States, a man with a compelling vision and a gift for public communication could construct a public identity that would prove remarkably resistant to revision. He built that identity deliberately and skillfully over the decade following his arrival. The identity he built was not false in every respect. His passion for rocketry and space exploration appears by all accounts to have been genuine. The engineering vision was real. The ambition was real. What the public identity concealed was the gap between the man who dreamed of the moon and the man who had signed the documents at Mittelwerk. The narrative architecture that protected von Braun and his colleagues rested on several supporting pillars, each of which served a distinct institutional interest. The first pillar was military necessity. The Soviet Union had emerged from the Second World War in possession of German rocket technology, German rocket facilities, and a substantial number of German rocket technicians. American military planners were under no illusions about Soviet intentions or Soviet capabilities. The Cold War had not yet been given that name, but its essential structure was already visible by late 1945. Two superpowers with incompatible ideologies and expanding military ambitions, competing for dominance across every dimension of national power. Ballistic missile technology was not a peripheral concern in that competition. It was central. The men who understood it best were the men who had built the V-2. If the United States did not secure them, the Soviet Union would. This argument was genuine and it was powerful, and it was used by Army intelligence to justify decisions that would otherwise have been unjustifiable. Its power came from the fact that it was largely true. The Soviets were indeed recruiting German scientists aggressively. Operation Ossowiecim, executed in October 1946, forcibly transported approximately 2,000 German technical specialists and their families to the Soviet Union in a single overnight operation. Engineers, scientists, and technicians taken from their homes with hours of notice and relocated to Soviet research facilities where they would spend years working on Soviet missile and aviation programs. The competition was real, the stakes were real, the argument from necessity had genuine force. But the argument from necessity is not a moral argument. It is a strategic argument, and in the space between those two categories, between what was strategically advantageous and what was morally coherent, the American government made a set of decisions that it then spent decades declining to examine in public. The second pillar of the official narrative was the deliberate compression of these men's wartime histories into a single category. Scientists, not SS officers, not Nazi Party members, not administrators of facilities where human beings were worked to death. Scientists. The word performed a specific function in the public discourse of the late 1940s. It placed its subjects in a category defined by knowledge and discovery, a category with its own implicit moral neutrality, as though the pursuit of technical understanding existed somehow outside the political and moral frameworks within which it was actually conducted. Von Braun was a scientist, that was true. He was also an SS officer, that was equally true. The official narrative made the first fact highly visible and the second fact nearly invisible, not through outright denial, which would have been fragile, but through sustained omission, which proved far more durable. The third pillar was classification, the specific records that would have made the wartime histories of these men visible to journalists, to congressional investigators, to the American public, the Nazi Party membership files, the SS personnel records, the documentation of Mittelwerk's operation were held by military and intelligence agencies that had no obligation to share them and every institutional incentive to keep them secure. Classification is not always, or even primarily, about protecting genuinely sensitive operational information. It is also in practice a mechanism for controlling which facts exist in the public domain and which facts exist only in rooms where they cannot generate political consequences. In the case of Operation Paperclip, classification served this second function with remarkable effectiveness for more than 4 decades. What the American public understood about the German rocket scientists in 1947, in 1957, and 1967 was almost entirely the product of a narrative that had been constructed by the agencies that had recruited them, constructed not through a single act of deliberate deception but through the accumulated effect of press releases, authorized biographies, television appearances, and the simple passage of time which tends to smooth the edges of histories that powerful institutions prefer to keep smooth. The first serious crack in that surface appeared not in an American newspaper or a congressional hearing, but in a small mechanical detail that an Associated Press reporter named Howard Blum noticed in the mid-1970s, a detail about a man named Arthur Rudolph, and the specific title he had held at a facility called Mittelwerk, and what that title had actually required him to do. But to understand why that crack mattered, you have to go underground. Into the tunnels. The Mittelwerk was not supposed to exist. In the official history of the V2 program that American military authorities assembled after the war, the version that supported the recruitment narrative, the version that emphasized scientific genius and engineering achievement, the production facility in the Harz Mountains occupied as little space as possible. The research was conducted at Peenemünde. The scientists worked at Peenemünde. The breakthroughs happened at Peenemünde. That was the story. Peenemünde was a legitimate research facility on the Baltic coast. It had laboratories and test stands and wind tunnels. It looked, in photographs, like what a rocket research center was supposed to look like: modern, purposeful, the physical expression of scientific ambition. It was the kind of place that could be shown to journalists and congressional delegations without generating uncomfortable questions. The Mittelwerk could not be shown to anyone. The decision to move V2 production underground had been made in 1943, after British bombers attacked Peenemünde in a raid that killed several hundred people and temporarily disrupted the program. Hitler demanded that production be relocated to a facility that could not be reached from the air. The site chosen was an existing tunnel complex in the Harz Mountains near the town of Nordhausen, a system of limestone chambers that had been used to store fuel and chemical supplies. It would be expanded into a full-scale underground factory capable of producing hundreds of rockets per month. The labor force for this construction and subsequent production came from the SS concentration camp system. The primary camp was called Dora, established in August 1943 as a subcamp of Buchenwald and later designated an independent concentration camp. At its peak, Dora and its associated subcamps held approximately 60,000 prisoners, men transported from Buchenwald, from Poland, from France, from the Soviet Union, from across the occupied territories of the Reich. They were Jewish prisoners, political prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, forced laborers conscripted from every country the Wehrmacht had overrun. The initial construction phase from late 1943 through early 1944 was carried out under conditions that prisoner testimony and post-war documentation describe with consistent detail. The tunnels had not been prepared for human habitation. There were no barracks. The prisoners slept in the tunnels themselves, on wooden shelves carved from the rock in chambers filled with the dust of blasting and excavation. There was no sanitation, food was minimal. The work ran around the clock in 12-hour shifts. Prisoners who collapsed from exhaustion or illness were beaten by SS guards. Those who could not recover quickly enough were transported to Buchenwald, which in practice meant they were transported to die. Historians estimate that approximately 20,000 people died in the Mittelwerk system between 1943 and 1945, from exhaustion, from starvation, from beatings, from execution. The executions were specifically documented. Prisoners suspected of sabotage were hanged in the tunnels, sometimes in groups, sometimes in front of the assembled workforce as a demonstration of what resistance would produce. The gallows were permanent fixtures of the production facility. The rockets were built in this environment. Each V-2 that rolled out of the Mittelwerk tunnels had been assembled by hands that belonged to men who were being worked to death. The technical specifications that von Braun and his engineering team had developed at Peenemünde were implemented at Mittelwerk by a labor force that had no choice in the matter and no protection under any law that the Reich recognized. This was not a peripheral or incidental aspect of the V2 program. It was the program. The decision to use concentration camp labor was not made by low-level administrators operating without the knowledge of the senior technical staff. It was made at the level of Albert Speer's armaments ministry, coordinated with the SS, and implemented in a facility that the senior engineers of the program visited regularly. The question of what Wernher von Braun knew about conditions at Mittelwerk has been debated by historians for decades, and the debate has been shaped by the fact that von Braun himself, throughout his American career, maintained that he had visited the facility only a small number of times and had been unaware of the worst conditions. He acknowledged that he had seen prisoners working. He claimed he had not understood the scale of the mortality or the nature of the treatment. The documentary record is less accommodating than his account. A letter exists written by von Braun in August 1944 requesting the transfer of additional prisoners from the concentration camp system to support expanded V2 production. The letter is addressed to an SS official and requests the allocation of skilled laborers from among the concentration camp population. It is written in the practical administrative language of wartime procurement, the same language used to request machine parts or fuel supplies. It identifies von Braun by name and title. It bears his signature. A post-war statement by Georg Ricke, who served as the general manager of Mittelwerk, placed von Braun at the facility on multiple occasions and described conversations in which production targets that could only be met by the existing labor force under the existing conditions, were discussed among the senior engineering staff. Yves Bayon, a French prisoner who survived Dora and later wrote a detailed memoir of his experience, described encountering German engineers in the tunnels who moved through the facility with the authority of men whose technical requirements shaped the conditions of everyone else's existence. His account did not name von Braun specifically. It described a class of people, the technical leadership of the program, for whom the prisoners were a production variable rather than a human concern. Arthur Rudolph's position at Mittelwerk was more direct and more thoroughly documented. Rudolph had been the operations director of the facility from its opening. His specific title was Mittelwerk GmbH Operations Director, and his specific responsibility was production, meeting the monthly output targets that the SS and the Armaments Ministry demanded. The means by which those targets were met were within his operational authority. The labor force was under his direction in the context of production. The conditions in the facility were conditions that he administered. Post-war documentation established that Rudolph had been present at least one mass hanging of prisoners accused of sabotage. An account from a survivor placed him in attendance when prisoners were executed in the tunnels as a warning to others. These accounts would not surface in any public forum in the United States for nearly 4 decades. Not because they did not exist, but because the institutional infrastructure that brought Rudolph to America had also constructed the environment in which such accounts had nowhere to go. The process by which that infrastructure was constructed, the specific bureaucratic mechanism that took men with records like Rudolph's and von Braun's and made them into American citizens with security clearances and government salaries, was documented in files that American intelligence agencies had classified and filed away. Those files would eventually be read, but first they had to be found. And the people who had hidden them had been very careful about where they put them. The file on Wernher von Braun that existed inside the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency in the summer of 1945 was accurate. It recorded his membership in the Nazi Party, which he had joined in 1937. It recorded his rank in the SS, Sturmbannführer, the equivalent of a major, which he had held since 1940. It recorded his association with the V-2 production program and the facility at Nordhausen. It recorded in the careful language of military intelligence assessment that his background contained elements that would, under the existing directives governing the immigration of German nationals, make him ineligible for entry into the United States. The directive in question was explicit. President Truman had signed an order in September 1946 stating that no person who had been a member of the Nazi Party and had been more than a nominal participant in its activities would be eligible for the program. The State Department, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and the Department of Justice all operated under versions of this prohibition. The policy existed because the United States had just spent 4 years and hundreds of thousands of lives fighting a regime defined by its ideology, and the idea of importing that ideology's servants into American government service was one that required, at minimum, a policy architecture capable of justifying or concealing it. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency solved this problem with a method that was, in its operational simplicity, almost elegant. They rewrote the files. The specific mechanism was described in detail by investigative journalist Linda Hunt, who spent years filing Freedom of Information Act requests with the Army, the CIA, the State Department, and the Justice Department, and who published her findings in 1991 in a book called Secret Agenda. The documents she obtained, thousands of pages of GIOA internal correspondence, security assessment reports, and immigration processing records, showed a pattern that was consistent across dozens of cases. A security assessment would be completed on a German scientist. The assessment would identify problematic elements in his background: Nazi Party membership, SS affiliation, involvement with facilities that used forced labor. The assessment would conclude, based on these findings, that the subject was ineligible for immigration under existing policy. The file would then be returned to GIOA. GIOA would prepare a revised security assessment. The revised assessment would describe the same individual. It would frequently omit the Nazi Party membership entirely, or characterize it as nominal, a bureaucratic formality required by the regime rather than an expression of genuine ideological commitment. SS rank would be described where it was mentioned at all, in ways that minimized its significance. Connections to production facilities using forced labor would not appear. The revised file would be submitted to the State Department and the INS, those agencies reviewing a document that had been prepared by a military intelligence organization with access to the original German records and with the institutional authority of the post-war occupation, had no independent means of verifying what had been omitted. They processed the applications based on what they were given. The scientists entered the United States. The operational name of the program, Paperclip, came from the physical marker that GIOA officers used to identify the files of scientists who had been approved for recruitment. A paperclip attached to the folder indicated that the subject was a priority acquisition. It was a mundane administrative detail that became, when the program's history eventually emerged, a symbol with a particular irony: the paperclip, that most ordinary of office supplies, marking the files of men whose histories had been carefully reorganized to make them processable by ordinary bureaucratic machinery. Brigadier General Charles Laux, who oversaw elements of the program for Army Ordnance, was direct in internal communications about what was being done and why. The scientists were too valuable to lose to policy compliance. The Cold War competition required them. The procedural obstacles, which is how the ethical and legal prohibitions on recruiting Nazi officials were characterized internally, needed to be managed. Managing them meant altering the documentary record in ways that would produce the required outcome. This was not a rogue operation conducted by a small group of officers acting without institutional sanction. The evidence that Hunt assembled and that subsequent researchers, including Annie Jacobson, confirmed in her 2014 book Operation Paperclip, showed a process that involved multiple agencies, multiple levels of command, and sustained coordination over years. The State Department eventually became aware that the security assessments it was receiving had been sanitized. Internal State Department memos from the late 1940s expressed concern about the accuracy of the GIOA-prepared files. Those concerns were noted, circulated within the department, and then set aside because the alternative to accepting the sanitized files was a confrontation with the Army over a program that the Army had concluded was a strategic necessity. The confrontation did not happen. The FBI was also aware that something was wrong with the recruitment process. J. Edgar Hoover, whose institutional instinct for the uses of damaging information was among the most developed in the history of American government, collected files on several Paperclip scientists that included materials contradicting their sanitized JO assessments. Hoover's files on von Braun, on Rudolph, and on others were retained within the FBI and used as bureaucratic leverage in the agency's ongoing competition with Army intelligence for primacy in domestic security matters. They were not shared with the public. They were not shared with Congress. They were a tool, not an accountability mechanism. The Office of Strategic Services, the wartime intelligence agency that was the predecessor to the CIA, conducted its own assessments of several Paperclip scientists and reached conclusions that were at variance with the JIO characterizations. OSS reports on specific individuals noted SS membership, noted connections to concentration camp labor, noted ideological histories that the JIO files had minimized or omitted. These reports were filed. They did not change the outcome of the immigration proceedings. What emerges from the documentary record, assembled across decades of FOIA litigation and archival research, is a picture of an institutional system making a deliberate collective choice, not through a single decision made at a single moment, but through the accumulated choices of dozens of officials across multiple agencies, each of whom understood what was happening, and each of whom concluded that their institutional interests, or the strategic interests they were charged with protecting, were better served by proceeding than by stopping. This is the characteristic shape of institutional wrongdoing at the highest levels of government. It does not look like a conspiracy in the dramatic sense, a secret meeting, a signed agreement, a moment of explicit collective decision to do something wrong. It looks like a bureaucratic process operating under pressure, in which the people with the authority to stop what is happening choose, repeatedly and for reasons they consider sufficient not to stop it. The files were altered, the scientists entered the country, and the question of what they had done before they arrived was placed in a category of information that the institutional infrastructure of the American national security state was very well equipped to manage. It managed it for nearly 40 years. Arthur Rudolph became an American citizen in 1954. He had arrived at Fort Bliss, Texas in 1945 as part of the initial group of German rocket specialists transferred under Operation Overcast. He had worked alongside von Braun at Fort Bliss and later at Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. He had contributed to the development of the Redstone missile, the Army's first operational ballistic missile, and had subsequently moved into the Saturn program when NASA absorbed the Huntsville team in 1960. By the time Apollo was in full development in the mid-1960s, Rudolph was the project manager for the Saturn V rocket, the most powerful launch vehicle ever built, the machine that would carry American astronauts to the moon. His security clearance was active. His salary was paid by the American taxpayer. His name appeared on the technical documentation of the program that would produce the most celebrated achievement in the history of human exploration. His file at the GOA had described him as a nominal Nazi. The actual record was different in ways that took decades to reconstruct, primarily because the reconstruction required access to documents held across multiple countries in archives that had not been systematically cross-referenced. The work was eventually done by the Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations, by independent historians, by journalists working the margins of the official record, and what it showed placed Rudolph's wartime role in terms that were irreconcilable with the characterization that had gotten him into the United States. As operations director of Mittelwerk, Rudolph had not been an engineer visiting a production facility. He had been the production facility's operational commander. The monthly output targets, the number of rockets that needed to roll out of the tunnels each month to satisfy the demands of the SS and the Armaments Ministry, were his responsibility. The allocation of the labor force that produced those rockets was within his authority. The disciplinary regime that maintained production discipline was administered under his oversight. Survivor testimony collected by the Office of Special Investigations in the late 1970s and early 1980s placed Rudolph at specific events within the facility that went beyond administrative oversight. Multiple accounts described his presence at the public hangings of prisoners accused of sabotage, executions conducted in the main tunnel with the assembled workforce compelled to watch. One survivor's account described Rudolph watching as prisoners were hanged from overhead cranes, their bodies left suspended as production continued around them. Rudolph denied these specific accounts. He acknowledged his role at Mittelwerk and the general use of concentration camp labor, but maintained that he had exercised no personal cruelty and had done what the situation required of a production manager operating within the constraints of the wartime system. This defense, that he was a functionary executing requirements imposed from above, that the system was responsible rather than the individual within it, was the same defense offered at Nuremberg and rejected there. The American legal system had participated in rejecting it at Nuremberg. The American intelligence system had imported into the United States a man whose wartime conduct fell within the same category. In 1982, the Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations, which had been established in 1979 specifically to identify and prosecute Nazi war criminals who had entered the United States, opened a formal investigation of Rudolph. The investigators worked for 3 years, assembling documentation from American archives, German archives, and the testimony of survivors. By 1984, they had built a case sufficient to support denaturalization proceedings, the legal process by which American citizenship can be revoked. Rudolph was confronted with the evidence in a closed meeting with OSI investigators in 1984. He was informed that the Justice Department had documentation establishing his wartime role in sufficient detail to support prosecution. He was offered an alternative. He could voluntarily renounce his American citizenship and leave the country, and the Justice Department would not pursue criminal charges. He accepted. In March 1984, Arthur Rudolph, the project manager of the Saturn V rocket, the man whose technical leadership had made Apollo possible, signed documents renouncing his American citizenship, surrendered his passport, and flew to West Germany. He was 80 years old. The NASA administrator at the time issued a statement saying that Rudolph's departure was a personal matter and that his contributions to the American space program were a matter of historical record. He was not prosecuted. He died in Hamburg in 1996. The case of Hubertus Strughold was equally documented and equally unresolved. Strughold had been one of Germany's leading aviation medicine researchers before the war, and his post-war American career was built on that expertise. He was brought to the United States under Paperclip in 1947 and became the founding director of the Department of Space Medicine at the Air Force School of Aviation Medicine in San Antonio. His research contributions to NASA's human spaceflight program were substantial. The design of the life support systems, the pressure suits, the protocols for monitoring astronaut physiology during spaceflight drew heavily on his work. NASA named its library at the Johnson Space Center the Hubertus Strughold Library in his honor. His wartime record contained elements that were known within parts of the American medical and intelligence communities for years before they reached public attention. Strughold had attended a conference in October 1942 in which the findings of experiments conducted on concentration camp prisoners at Dachau were presented. The experiments involved placing prisoners in low-pressure chambers that simulated high-altitude conditions, subjecting them to extreme cold to study hypothermia and testing the effects of forced ingestion of seawater. The subjects of these experiments were not volunteers. They were prisoners who had been selected by SS physicians. Many did not survive. The data generated by their deaths was what was being presented at the conference Strughold attended. Whether Strughold personally conducted experiments on prisoners, or directed such experiments, or simply received and used the data generated by others who did, was a question that the available documentation did not resolve with the precision that criminal prosecution would require. What the documentation established was that he was aware of how the data had been obtained, that the knowledge embedded in the research he received came from human beings who had been subjected to procedures that killed them. His GEOA security assessment had not mentioned the October 1942 conference. In 1993, the city of San Antonio renamed a street that had been named in his honor. In 1995, the state of Ohio removed his name from a medical award. In 2006, the International Space Hall of Fame in New Mexico removed his portrait from display, following a petition by survivors' organizations. NASA quietly renamed the library at Johnson Space Center without public announcement. He had died in 1986, having never been investigated by the Justice Department, having never been confronted with the documentation of his wartime record in any legal forum. Kurt Blome presented the most extreme case in the Paperclip recruitment record. Blome had been the deputy health leader of the Reich and had overseen the German biological weapons research program during the war. His specific responsibility had included experiments on concentration camp prisoners to develop and test biological warfare agents. He was tried at the Nuremberg doctors' trial in 1947, one of the 12 Nuremberg military tribunal proceedings that followed the main Nuremberg trials, on charges that included conducting medical experiments on human subjects without their consent. He was acquitted. The prosecution's evidence was judged insufficient for conviction under the specific legal standards applied at the tribunal, though the presiding judges noted that the evidence established that the experimental program he oversaw had existed and that prisoners had been used as subjects. Within months of his acquittal at Nuremberg, Blome was being interviewed by American military physicians at Camp King in West Germany regarding his knowledge of biological warfare agents and his research findings. The interview was conducted under the auspices of Operation Paperclip. The Americans were specifically interested in what he knew about Soviet biological weapons capabilities and about the German research that might be relevant to American defensive and offensive biological warfare programs. the man acquitted at Nuremberg of conducting biological experiments on concentration camp prisoners, was being recruited by American military medicine within the year. Blome was ultimately not brought to the United States. The State Department, in his specific case, declined to process the application, possibly because the Nuremberg acquittal was recent enough to make the political risk visible in a way it was not in other cases. But the fact that the recruitment was attempted, that American military physicians sat across a table from a man who had just stood in the Nuremberg dock and asked him what he knew about killing people with biological agents, was itself a precise illustration of what Operation Paperclip had become by 1947. The moral framework that the United States had prosecuted at Nuremberg and the strategic framework that the United States was operating under in the emerging Cold War were in direct and irreconcilable conflict. And in that conflict, conducted in the specific institutional space where Army intelligence, military medicine, and the immigration bureaucracy intersected, the strategic framework was winning every time. The directive that President Truman signed in September 1946 was unambiguous in its language. It stated that the exploitation of German scientists for American military and scientific purposes was authorized, and that the program would be administered through the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency in coordination with the State Department and the Immigration and Naturalization Service. It also stated, in terms that left no room for interpretive flexibility, that the program would not be used to import into the United States any person who had been a member of the Nazi Party and had been more than a nominal participant or an active supporter of Nazi militarism. The directive was signed by the President of the United States. It carried the full legal authority of the executive branch. It represented the considered policy of an administration that had just presided over the liberation of concentration camps, the prosecution of war criminals at Nuremberg, and the deaths of more than 400,000 American soldiers in a war against the regime, whose servants this directive was now, with careful qualification, offering to accommodate. Within the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, the response to Truman's directive was practical rather than political. The problem the directive created was an administrative one, a gap between the scientists whom Army intelligence had already recruited and was committed to retaining, and the eligibility criteria that the directive established. The solution to an administrative problem is an administrative solution. JIOA's administrative solution was to ensure that the security files of the scientists it wanted to keep did not contain the information that would make them ineligible. The man most directly responsible for implementing this solution was a JIOA director named Bosquet Wev. Wev was an Army officer who had been assigned to JIOA in the immediate post-war period and who became the program's operational driving force during the critical years of the late 1940s when the immigration processing was being completed. His internal correspondence, recovered through FOIA requests and declassified in stages from the 1970s onward, shows a man who understood precisely what he was doing and who had concluded that doing it was justified by the strategic circumstances. In a memo written in 1947, Wev addressed directly the concern that had been raised by State Department officials who had noticed discrepancies between the JIOA security assessments and independent information they had received about specific scientists. Wev's argument was stated plainly. The possibility of the Soviet Union's exploitation of German scientists, he wrote, was far more serious than the exploitation of a former Nazi. Bringing up the past, he continued, was a picayune objection given what was at stake. Picayune. That was the word a senior American military intelligence officer used to describe the objection that men who had administered facilities where 20,000 people were worked to death should perhaps not be given American citizenship and government security clearances. The memo was not a slip of judgment or an intemperate expression of frustration. It was a policy argument made in official correspondence by an officer whose institutional role gave that argument operational force. And the argument prevailed, not because it was persuasive on its merits, but because it aligned with the interests of the agencies and officials who held the power to determine the outcome. The State Department raised objections on multiple occasions. The historical record shows State Department officials writing internally that the security assessments being provided by JIOA were inconsistent with information from other sources, that the backgrounds of specific individuals appeared to have been misrepresented, and that the department was being asked to process immigration applications on the basis of documentation whose accuracy it had reason to doubt. These objections were not frivolous. They were legally and institutionally grounded. The State Department had responsibilities under American immigration law that were not suspended by the strategic imperatives of the Cold War, however real those imperatives were. The officials who raised these concerns were doing their jobs. They were overruled. The mechanism of the overruling was not a formal order from a superior authority instructing the State Department to stand down. It was something more characteristic of how bureaucratic power actually operates at the intersection of competing agencies, a sustained pattern of non-responsiveness, of objections noted and not acted upon, of a process that continued to move forward because the institutional momentum behind it was greater than the institutional momentum behind stopping it. Army intelligence controlled the original German records. Army intelligence controlled the physical custody of the scientists who were being processed. Army intelligence had the strategic argument, the Soviet threat, the missile gap, the imperative of technological competition, that resonated with the post-war political environment in ways that State Department concerns about immigration procedure did not. The balance of institutional power was not even close. Congress was not an effective check on this process for reasons that were structural rather than incidental. The program operated under classifications that kept its specific details outside the public record. The oversight mechanisms that might have caught what was happening, the relevant congressional committees, were populated by members whose relationship to military and intelligence agencies was, in the post-war period, largely cooperative rather than adversarial. The Cold War consensus that was hardening by the late 1940s created a political environment in which challenging military intelligence operations on grounds of procedural irregularity or moral consistency was not a path that attracted political support. There was also a specific institutional actor who might have disrupted the process and chose not to J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover's FBI had independent information on multiple paperclip scientists that contradicted the Giowa characterizations. The FBI's domestic intelligence operations had produced files on von Braun, on Rudolph, on others that documented Nazi Party membership, SS affiliation, and connections to wartime programs that the Giowa files minimized or omitted. Hoover was aware that these files contained information that, if shared with the appropriate authorities, would have created serious complications for the Giowa program. He did not share them. The reasons were institutional rather than ideological. Hoover's primary concern with Paperclip was not the moral history of the scientists being recruited. It was the jurisdictional question of whether Army intelligence or the FBI would have primary responsibility for monitoring the activities of foreign nationals brought into the United States under government programs. The files Hoover held were leverage in that jurisdictional competition, assets to be used in negotiations with the Army over the terms of the FBI's domestic security role, not tools of accountability to be deployed in the public interest. This pattern, information held as bureaucratic leverage rather than disclosed as accountability, was characteristic of how the national security state managed uncomfortable knowledge in the post-war period. The information did not disappear. It was held by agencies that understood its value precisely because they understood its sensitivity, and used in ways that served those agencies' institutional interests rather than any broader public purpose. The result was a program that operated for years in the gap between what American law prohibited, what American policy declared, and what American intelligence agencies actually did, a gap maintained by the collective decision of dozens of officials across multiple agencies who concluded, each for their own institutional reasons, that the gap should continue to exist. What eventually began to close that gap was not a congressional investigation, not a presidential directive, not an institutional act of accountability by any of the agencies involved. It was the work of a small number of journalists, historians, and Justice Department lawyers who spent years navigating FOIA requests, archival research, and survivor testimony to reconstruct a record that the institutional infrastructure had been designed to prevent from being assembled. The first significant public crack appeared in 1974, when the investigative journalist Drew Pearson and his partner Jack Anderson published a column that identified several paperclip scientists by name and described elements of their wartime records that had not appeared in any official account. The column cited specific documents and specific histories. It was published in hundreds of newspapers across the country. The response from NASA and the Defense Department was silence. No official denial, no acknowledgement, no investigation. Silence, sustained, and institutional, which is the response of a bureaucracy that has calculated that engaging with an accusation creates more risk than ignoring it. The silence held for another decade. And then Arthur Rudolph got on a plane to West Germany, and the silence became very much harder to maintain. On July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the surface of the moon. The Saturn V rocket that had carried him there was the most complex machine ever built by human beings. A three-stage vehicle standing 363 feet tall, generating 7.5 million pounds of thrust at liftoff, the product of 400,000 engineers, technicians, and workers who had contributed to its development over a decade. It was, by almost any measure, the supreme technological achievement of the 20th century. The man who had served as its project manager was at the moment of the landing, watching the television coverage from his home in Huntsville, Alabama. Arthur Rudolph had retired from NASA 2 years earlier, in 1969, with a commendation from the agency for his contributions to the program. He had received NASA's Distinguished Service Medal, the agency's highest honor. The citation described his leadership of the Saturn V program in terms of engineering excellence and organizational achievement. The citation did not mention Mittelwerk. The public did not know about Mittelwerk, not in any specific or detailed way. The general fact that German rocket scientists had been brought to the United States after the war was known. It had been reported in broad strokes in the press coverage of the space program, the specific histories of the men involved, the specific wartime records that the JOA had sanitized, the specific conditions of the facility where the V-2 had been produced. These were not part of the public understanding of what the space program was or where it had come from. When Walter Cronkite narrated the Apollo 11 coverage for CBS, and when the American public watched in collective amazement as Armstrong's boot pressed into the lunar dust, the frame through which that moment was understood was one of national achievement, of democratic ambition realized, of a promise made by a murdered president fulfilled. It was a genuine frame. The achievement was genuine. The ambition was genuine. The fulfillment was real. But the frame was also incomplete in ways that the people responsible for it had worked deliberately to ensure. Wernher von Braun stood at the center of the public celebration of Apollo in a way that no other individual did. He had become, over the 2 decades of his American career, the human face of the space program, the visionary who had seen beyond the military applications of rocket technology to the grander possibility of human exploration, who had used the tools and the resources of the Cold War competition to build towards something that transcended the competition itself. This narrative was not entirely false. His genuine belief in space exploration appears to have been real, a constant that ran from his adolescent reading of science fiction through the SS uniform and the Mittelwerk visits and the Fort Bliss years and the Disney programs and the Saturn V and all the way to July 1969. But the narrative required the erasure of the distance between Peenemünde and Nordhausen, the erasure of everything that happened in the tunnels that the official story of the space program could not accommodate. In 1969, a poet named Bertolt Brecht was already dead, but a poem he had written before the war circulated in certain circles in the context of the moon landing, a poem about unnamed men who build things that other men receive credit for, about the questions that official histories do not ask. It was not widely read in the United States at the time. It was the kind of question that the institutional momentum of the Apollo program, the genuine wonder of the achievement, and the careful management of the public narrative had successfully prevented from becoming part of the mainstream conversation. That conversation began to change in the decade that followed. The Freedom of Information Act, passed in 1966 and significantly strengthened in 1974 following the Watergate revelations, created a legal mechanism through which journalists and researchers could compel the release of government documents that agencies would otherwise retain indefinitely. It was an imperfect tool. Agencies could still withhold documents on national security grounds, could delay responses for years, could release materials in forms so heavily redacted as to be nearly uninformative. But it was a tool that had not existed before, and in the hands of persistent researchers it began to produce results. Linda Hunt filed her first FOIA requests in the late 1970s while working as a television journalist. What she initially received was heavily redacted. She filed again and again, and appealed denials and requested specific document categories by username when she had enough information to know what to ask for. The process took years. What emerged incrementally from the Army, from the CIA, from the State Department, from the Justice Department was a documentary record that told a story fundamentally different from the official one. The JIOA memos showing the systematic alteration of security assessments, the internal State Department correspondence expressing concerns about the accuracy of the files being processed, the FBI reports that contradicted the JIOA characterizations, the original German records, Nazi Party membership documents, SS personnel files, Mittelwerk administrative records, that showed what had been removed from the files that reached the immigration authorities. Hunt published Secret Agenda in 1991. It was the first comprehensive account of the Paperclip program based on the documentary record rather than on the official narrative, and its reception illustrated the degree to which that narrative had successfully insulated itself from scrutiny for 4 decades. The book received serious attention in the press. It was reviewed, discussed, cited in subsequent historical work. It did not produce a congressional investigation. It did not produce an official government response beyond the routine non-engagement that the agencies involved had perfected over years. The Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations, which had been working the Rudolph case since the late 1970s in parallel with Hunt's journalistic investigation, produced the most concrete institutional consequence of the accountability effort, Rudolph's departure in 1984 was the OSI's most significant paperclip result, the only case in which a paperclip scientist was directly confronted with the documentary evidence of his wartime record and compelled to face a formal consequence. It was also, in an important sense, a consequence designed to avoid the larger confrontation. The OSI's offer to Rudolph, renounce citizenship and leave, and we will not prosecute, was not only a function of evidentiary calculation, though the investigators did assess that a criminal prosecution would face significant challenges given Rudolph's age, the passage of time, and the difficulties of presenting survivor testimony in a courtroom setting. It was also a function of institutional management. A full criminal prosecution of Arthur Rudolph would have required a public trial. A public trial would have required the introduction into the public record of documents and testimony that went far beyond Rudolph's individual case, documents that implicated the institutional process by which he and dozens of others had been brought into the United States, the agencies that had altered his file, the officials who had signed off on his security clearance decade after decade. The OSI had a mandate to address individual cases of Nazi war criminals who had entered the United States. It did not have a mandate, and in practice did not have the institutional support to conduct a comprehensive examination of the government program that had brought those individuals here. The individual was addressed, the program was not. Von Braun had died in 1977 of pancreatic cancer in Alexandria, Virginia. He died as an American hero. The eulogies were generous. President Carter issued a statement. NASA lowered its flags. The obituaries described him as a visionary, a pioneer, the father of American space exploration. Some of them mentioned briefly and without elaboration that he had worked on the V-2 program in Germany during the war. None of the major American obituaries mentioned Mittelwerk by name. The gap between what the historical record contained and what the official commemorations acknowledged was not an accident. It was the final expression of a management effort that had begun in Bavaria in 1945, had been institutionalized through the Giowa file alteration process, had been sustained through 4 decades of classification and bureaucratic non-engagement, and had ultimately succeeded in its primary objective, which was not to make the history disappear, but to ensure that it never occupied the same frame as the achievement. Apollo and Mittelwerk, the moon landing in the tunnel, the Saturn fee and the gallows in the production hall. These things existed in the same historical continuum. They had never been allowed to exist in the same public conversation. In 1998, Congress passed the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act, which mandated the declassification and release of government records relating to Nazi war criminals and the programs that had dealt with them. The act produced the release of approximately 8 million pages of previously classified documents from the CIA, the Army, the State Department, and other agencies. Among those documents were materials relating to Operation Paperclip, the original assessments, the altered files, the internal correspondence that showed how the program had operated. The documents confirmed what Hunt and others had established through FOIA litigation. They added detail and specificity. They made the record more complete. They did not produce a congressional hearing. They did not produce an official government apology. They did not produce a formal re-examination of the honors and commemorations that had been bestowed on men whose wartime records the documents described. They went into the archives, where they are available to researchers who know to look for them, who have the background to understand what they contain, and who are willing to spend the time required to assemble a picture from documents that were never designed to be assembled into one. There is a photograph taken at Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama in 1956. It shows a group of men in civilian suits standing in front of a rocket on a test stand. They are smiling. Several of them are looking at the camera with the relaxed confidence of men who know they are doing important work and expect to be recognized for it. The rocket behind them is the Jupiter C, a direct descendant of the V-2, built by the same team, using the same fundamental engineering principles that had been developed at Peenemünde and implemented at Mittelwerk. The men in the photograph are identified in the caption by name and title: American engineers, American scientists working on America's space program. Their SS ranks are not in the caption. The photograph is in the NASA archives. It is publicly accessible. It is one of thousands of similar images from the same period, images that document, with the visual language of institutional pride, the work of men whose presence in those photographs required the alteration of their personnel files, the bypass of presidential directives, and the sustained institutional effort of multiple agencies across more than a decade. The history that those images do not show is not hidden in the sense of being inaccessible. It is hidden in the sense of having been excluded from the frame. The frame was chosen deliberately, maintained institutionally, and has proven remarkably durable, because the achievement it celebrates is real, and real achievements generate a cultural investment that makes the complete picture uncomfortable to look at. The discomfort is the point. Not in a punitive sense, not as an argument that the space program should be unmade, or that the moon landing should be retrospectively disqualified, or that the engineering contributions of the men involved should be erased from the record they actually belong to. These are not serious positions, and the history does not require them. The achievement was real. The knowledge was real. The rockets worked. The discomfort is the point because it is the precise location where the official narrative and the complete history diverge, and the divergence reveals something about how powerful institutions manage the relationship between what they accomplish and what they do in order to accomplish it. What Operation Paperclip reveals, stripped of the Cold War justifications and the technical achievements and the carefully constructed public identities, is a specific answer to a specific question. What does a government do when its strategic interests and its stated moral commitments are in direct conflict? The answer that the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency gave, and that the Army and the Air Force and eventually NASA and the FBI and the State Department and successive presidential administrations gave by their collective non-engagement with what those agencies had done, was that the strategic interests win. They win procedurally, through the alteration of documents. They win institutionally, through the management of classification and the control of the public record. They win culturally, through the construction of public identities that place the achievement in the foreground and the history in a filing cabinet. They win in the end by making the question of the moral cost invisible, not to everyone, but to enough people for long enough that by the time the documentation becomes available, the institutions that would be most embarrassed by a full accounting have had decades to establish a different story as the default understanding. The survivors of Dora and Mittelwerk did not have decades. They had the specific years of their lives that the facility consumed, and the specific memories of what they had witnessed, and the specific frustration of watching the men who had administered the conditions of their imprisonment receive American citizenship, government salaries, NASA medals, and presidential commendations. Jean Michel, a French prisoner who survived Dora and later wrote a memoir called Dora, described attending a space launch in the 1960s. He had been invited as a guest through a French veterans organization to witness an American rocket launch from Cape Canaveral. He described standing among the crowd watching the rocket rise, knowing what he knew about who had built it and what had been required to build it, and finding that the experience of watching it produced not pride or wonder but a specific and irresolvable grief. He was watching something that had been made possible in part by the deaths of people he had known. The rocket did not know this. The crowd did not know this. The officials who had invited him did not appear to know this, or to have considered that he might find the invitation complicated. His account does not appear in the official histories of the American space program. The Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act of 1998 was the closest the American government came to a formal institutional reckoning with Operation Paperclip. The 8 million pages it produced are available. The researchers who have worked through them, Hunt, Jacobson, the historians who have written about the program in the decades since the documents became accessible, have built a record that is now comprehensive enough that the essential facts are not in serious dispute among historians who have examined it. The essential facts are these. The United States government, through a specific institutional process involving multiple agencies over multiple years, deliberately altered the immigration records of more than 1,000 German scientists to conceal their Nazi Party affiliations, their SS memberships, and in some cases their direct involvement in war crimes, in order to bring them into the United States in violation of the explicit directives of the President. The program produced genuine technological achievements, including contributions to the space program that culminated in the Apollo moon landings. It also produced the immigration and naturalization of individuals whose wartime conduct, had it been accurately represented to the relevant authorities, would have made them subject to prosecution rather than recruitment. These two things are both true. The official history of the space program has, for most of its existence, treated them as irreconcilable, as though acknowledging the second truth would negate or contaminate the first. This is not a historical judgment. It is a political one, and it is a political judgment that has served the institutions responsible for the program rather than the public interest in an accurate accounting of what was done in the country's name. The accountability that did occur was narrow and late. Arthur Rudolph left the country in 1984, 39 years after the end of the war. No one else among the major paperclip figures faced comparable consequences. The agencies that altered the files, that bypassed the presidential directives, that managed the classification systems that kept the history in the dark, none of them faced institutional consequences of any kind. The officials who wrote the memos, Bosquet-Webb and his colleagues, the men who used the word picayune to describe the objection that war criminals should perhaps not receive American citizenship, died in the same comfortable obscurity as the subjects of the program they administered. The question that the history of Operation Paperclip leaves open is not a historical one. The history is documented. The question is a political and moral one, and it is the same question that the program itself posed and answered in a specific way in 1945 and 1946 and in every year thereafter until the documents were finally released. The question is about the cost of achievement, about who pays that cost, who counts as a person whose suffering is included in the moral ledger of an undertaking, and who gets to decide when a strategic or technological achievement is sufficient justification for what was done to produce it. The United States government's answer to that question, in the specific case of Operation Paperclip, was that the 20,000 people who died in the tunnels of Mittelwerk were not on the ledger. They were not mentioned in the press releases. They were not named in the obituaries of the men who had administered the facility where they died. They were not represented in the congressional committees that oversaw the space program. They were not in the frame of the photograph at Redstone Arsenal. They were in the tunnels where they had always been, underground in the dark, out of the frame, doing the work that the official history would later attribute to the men who stood above them. The rockets worked, that is a fact. The people who built them with their bodies, under conditions that killed 20,000 of them, also existed, that is equally a fact. The official history of the American space program has spent 80 years deciding which of these facts belongs in the story and which belongs in the archive. The archive is open now. The documents are available. The record is assembled for anyone willing to read it in enough detail to make the complete picture visible. What remains is the question of whether the institutions that constructed the incomplete picture will ever formally acknowledge what the complete one contains, whether the moral ledger that was deliberately left unbalanced in 1945 will ever be settled in any form that the people it was kept from would recognize as honest. That question has not been answered. It has not, in any official forum with the authority and the will to address it, been seriously asked. The tunnels are a museum now. You can visit them. They have been preserved by the German government as a memorial to the prisoners who died there. There are plaques. There are photographs. There is a guided tour that explains what happened in those chambers and who died in them and why. The Saturn V rocket that Arthur Rudolph managed into existence stands on display at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, and at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, and at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama, the city where the team that built it lived and worked for the better part of 2 decades, in houses provided by the Army, in a community that knew them as neighbors and colleagues, and did not, for a very long time, know much else. Both of these things are true. They have always been true. The distance between them, the distance between the tunnel and the rocket, between the memorial and the museum, between what the archive contains and what the official history acknowledges, is the precise measurement of what Operation Paperclip cost. The bill has not been paid. It is still outstanding.